This is my true story. I gave everything for my son. I worked for decades, saved every dollar, and built a fortune of $3 million. I thought my sacrifice would be rewarded with respect and love. But instead, I was humiliated in ways I never imagined. My own son forced me to eat from the dog's bowl, as if I was less than an animal. That day, something inside me broke. But I didn't shout. I didn't fight. I planned. What I did next will shock you. Tell me where you're watching from and the time right now, and please subscribe. I worked my whole life for my son. From the day he was born, I decided my life was no longer my own. Every breath I took, every step I walked, every dollar I earned, it was all for him. I did not live for myself. I lived for my boy. I woke up before the sun, and I went to bed long after it set. My back carried weight it should not have carried. My hands grew rough and cracked from labor, and my body aged long before its time. But I never stopped. I never complained. I never said, enough. Because in my heart, I believed it was worth it. I believed that every sacrifice would give him a better life. I remember the winters when food was scarce. I would put the last piece of bread on his plate and tell him I was not hungry. I remember the summers when I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs, just so his school fees were paid on time. I remember walking home in torn shoes while he walked in new ones. I remember selling my watch, the only gift my late wife had given me, just so I could buy him the books he needed for college. I told myself again and again that my hunger did not matter, my pain did not matter, my losses did not matter, only his future mattered. When he grew older and wanted to study in the best schools, I emptied my savings. I went without medicine when I was sick, because tuition had to be paid. When he wanted to start a business, I took the money I had put aside for my old age, and I handed it to him without hesitation. I signed papers I barely understood, just because he said it was important. I trusted him with everything, and I gave him everything. I did not keep anything for myself, not even a safety net. All I kept was the hope that one day he would look at me and see the man who gave him his wings. I bought the house he lives in. I made sure there was no debt attached to it, no loan, no mortgage, nothing that could weigh him down. I worked like a mule so that he could live like a prince. I built a fortune of $3 million in savings, property, and investments. To me, that money was never mine. I thought of it as his shield, his treasure, his safety when the world grew cruel. I believed I was building him a fortress of comfort, a future where he would never have to taste the bitterness of poverty like I once did. I used to sit alone at night and smile, imagining him standing tall one day, telling his children and his friends that his father had worked hard for him, that his father had built the ground beneath his feet, that his father had given him everything. That was my dream. My reward was never going to be money. My reward was never going to be luxury. My reward was going to be respect. My reward was going to be love. My reward was going to be gratitude. I thought when my hair turned white and my hands could no longer work, he would guide me to my chair, he would sit with me, he would say, "Father, rest now. You carried me for so long, let me carry you." But I was wrong. I see it clearly now. All my life I lived for him, but he does not live for me. I poured myself empty to fill him, but he does not remember the pouring. I gave up my comfort so he could live in comfort, but he does not remember my hunger. I built a fortune not for myself, but for him. And yet he looks at me as if I am a beggar, as if I am a weight tied around his neck. The $3 million that exists today, the $3 million that came from my sweat, my hunger, my broken back, he thinks it belongs to him. He thinks it was always his. He thinks he built it. He forgets that every penny was placed there by me. I sit in silence sometimes and wonder where I went wrong. Did I give too much? Did I protect him too well? Did I make him believe life was too easy? I carried every hardship so he would never feel it. Maybe that was my mistake. Because he never knew hunger, he cannot understand my hunger. Because he never knew sacrifice, he cannot respect my sacrifice. Because he never went without, he cannot value what was given. Still, in my heart, I kept believing that blood would speak louder than arrogance. I thought maybe when he looked at me, he would remember, I am not just an old man sitting in his house. I am the father who gave him everything. I am the reason he stands where he stands today. But instead of love, he gives me mockery. Instead of respect, he gives me humiliation. I gave him all my years, and in return, I have become invisible in his. That is what hurts most. Not the work, not the hunger, not the pain of my body breaking, but the truth that the boy I loved more than myself has forgotten me. He has erased me. He walks through the life I built, and he acts as if I never existed. And still, even after all this, even after the way he speaks to me, I sometimes catch myself praying for him, wishing good for him, hoping he finds happiness. That is the curse of a father's heart. We give, even when we are broken. We love, even when we are unloved. We hope, even when there is no reason left to hope. But I am beginning to understand something. Love alone is not enough. Sacrifice alone is not enough. Respect must come from the heart of the child, and if it does not come, then all the sacrifice in the world cannot force it. I worked my whole life for my son, but my son does not see me as a father anymore. He sees me as an old man in his way. And that truth is harder to bear than all the hunger I have ever known. I began to see the change in my son, but I refused to believe it at first. I told myself it was only stress, maybe the pressure of business, maybe the weight of responsibility. I wanted to believe my boy was still the same child I raised with trembling hands and an empty stomach. But as days passed, the truth became clearer, and it broke me more than any hunger or pain I had ever endured. My son was no longer my son. The boy I had worked for was gone. In his place stood a man who looked at me not with love, but with irritation, with coldness, sometimes even with disgust. It started in small ways. He stopped listening to me. When I tried to speak, he would brush my words aside like dust. He no longer asked how I was feeling, no longer cared if I had eaten, no longer cared if I was sick. My voice, which once guided him, became noise in his ears. I thought perhaps he was busy, perhaps he was distracted, perhaps he was tired. But deep inside, I began to feel the shift. Respect was leaving his heart. Gratitude was fading from his memory. Then came the mocking. At first it was just in private. Small remarks about my slow steps, about my wrinkled face, about my shaky hands. He would laugh when I struggled to lift something, laugh when I forgot a word, laugh when I repeated myself. I sat there in silence, forcing a smile, pretending I did not hear. But I heard. Every word cut me deeper than any blade. And then it spread to public moments. At family gatherings, at dinners with friends, he would turn me into a joke. He would laugh about my age, laugh about my weakness, laugh about how useless old men become. The people around him laughed too, but I sat in silence, my heart burning. They did not know the truth. They did not know that the man he mocked was the same man who gave him his very life, his very fortune. His wife joined in as well. She never looked at me as family. To her, I was nothing but a burden in the house. She whispered to him that I was in the way, that I cost too much, that I took up space, and instead of defending me, my son agreed. He nodded at her words, sometimes even added his own. They spoke of me as if I was a problem to be solved, not a father to be respected. I heard them. I heard every word. I sat in my room at night, and their whispers echoed in my mind. What hurt me the most was how quickly he forgot. He forgot the nights I went without food so he could eat. He forgot the years I worked until my bones ached just to pay his tuition. He forgot the money I poured into his business, the house I bought for him, the fortune of $3 million I built for his future. He walked around with pride, boasting of his wealth, bragging of his success, but never once did he mention the man who made it possible. To his friends, he was self-made. To his wife, he was the provider. To the world, he was the rich man who had done it all by himself. And I was just the old man in the corner, invisible, forgotten, erased. The arrogance grew with time. He no longer saw me as a father. He saw me as an old body eating food that belonged to him. He saw me as a shadow in his house, a weight on his shoulders, an obstacle in his path. He treated me not like blood, but like a stranger who had overstayed his welcome. Sometimes he would not even look at me. Sometimes he would walk past me as if I did not exist. And when he did look, his eyes carried no warmth, only coldness. I asked myself again and again where I went wrong. Did I love him too much? Did I give him too much? Did I protect him so well from hunger and pain that he forgot what they felt like? Because a child who never knows hunger cannot respect food. A child who never knows struggle cannot respect sacrifice. A child who never sees the cost cannot value what is given. I had carried every burden so he would not feel it, and in doing so, I raised a man who thought life owed him everything. I thought love would be enough. I thought sacrifice would be remembered. But as I sat in that house, watching the boy I raised mock me, dismiss me, and treat me like a burden, I understood something painful. Love is not always enough. Sacrifice does not always bring gratitude. Sometimes it brings arrogance. Sometimes it makes children believe they were owed everything, as if the father's suffering was nothing more than duty. The day came when I looked at him and saw no son in him anymore. I saw a stranger who carried my blood but not my respect. I saw a man who thought he was above me, who thought he was greater than me, who thought my age made me useless, who thought my silence made me weak. And that realization broke me. Because I had not worked all my life to be treated like this. I had not given everything only to become nothing in his eyes. I kept silent, but inside I knew something was changing in me as well. My patience was wearing thin. My silence was filling with weight. My pain was no longer just sorrow. It was becoming something else. It was becoming the seed of a decision, the beginning of a storm. I did not speak it yet, but I felt it. For the first time in my life, I began to think not of his future, but of mine. The night that broke me will never leave my memory. I had seen many hard days in my life. I had walked through hunger. I had worked through pain. I had lived through storms of poverty and loneliness. But nothing, not even the darkest days of my youth, prepared me for the humiliation I faced inside my own son's house. It was evening, and I was tired. My body was weak, my stomach was empty, and my spirit was heavy. I had worked all day in silence, doing small chores around the house, trying not to be a burden. I waited quietly for dinner, hoping maybe tonight I would sit at the table like a human being. I hoped maybe tonight my son would look at me and remember that I was his father, not some stranger under his roof. But when I asked softly if there was food for me, what I received was not kindness. It was cruelty. My son turned his head and his eyes met mine. There was no love in them, no warmth, no respect. Only coldness, only irritation. He looked at me as though my question was an offense, as though my hunger was an insult. Then, with a cruel smirk, he pointed not to the table, not to a chair, not to a plate of food. He pointed to the floor. On the floor, by the corner of the kitchen, sat the dog's bowl, half filled with scraps, bones, and leftovers not even fit for an animal. And in that moment, my son's message was clear. If I was hungry, I could eat there. If I wanted food, I could kneel like the dog. My heart froze. My body trembled. I thought maybe he was joking, maybe he was testing me. But he was not joking. His wife stood beside him, and she laughed. She covered her mouth and laughed as though my humiliation was entertainment. And my son, my own blood, laughed with her. They stood side by side, amused by the sight of an old man with an empty stomach, daring him to crawl on the floor. I cannot explain the pain I felt in that moment. It was not only hunger, it was not only shame, it was the breaking of my soul. I had carried that boy in my arms when he was helpless. I had given him food when I went without. I had worked until my hands bled so that he could eat like a king. And now, in return, he was telling me to eat like a dog. I looked down at the bowl. The smell of stale food rose into my nose. My stomach ached with hunger, but my spirit ached more. I lowered myself slowly, my knees weak, my hands shaking, and for the first time in my life, I felt smaller than I ever thought possible. The floor was cold beneath me, and the dog's bowl sat waiting. My son's laughter echoed above me. His wife's laughter cut me like knives. I wanted to cry, but the tears would not come. My pride, though broken, would not let them see me weep. I touched the edge of the bowl, but my heart screamed at me. I remembered the nights when I had gone to bed hungry so that my son could eat. I remembered the winters when I had worked in freezing air so that his stomach would be full. I remembered every sacrifice, every tear, every step that brought me to this moment. And I realized what had happened. My love had been turned into humiliation. My sacrifices had been forgotten. My dignity had been stripped away by the very child I had raised. I pushed the bowl away. I could not eat from it. I could not lower myself to that point. I sat back, staring at the floor, my stomach empty, but my decision beginning to form. My son's laughter grew louder. His wife's laughter followed. To them, it was victory. To me, it was the end of silence. That night, I lay in my bed, my eyes open, my heart heavy. I could not sleep. I could still hear their laughter in my ears. I could still see the bowl on the floor. I could still feel the sting of humiliation burning inside me. And in that sleepless night, I made a promise to myself. If my son wanted to treat me like a dog, then he would learn what it felt like to live like one. If he thought my hunger was entertainment, then I would show him what true hunger was. He had forgotten who held the keys to his fortune. He had forgotten who built the life he was so proud of, and I would remind him, not with words, not with anger, not with shouting, but with silence and action. That bowl on the floor was not only the lowest moment of my life, it was also the moment that gave me strength. It was the moment that told me enough was enough. It was the moment that planted the seed of revenge in my heart. And I knew, when the time came, my son would regret every laugh, every insult, every act of cruelty. I had eaten hunger before. I could endure it again. But he had never tasted hunger. He had never felt what it was like to be stripped of dignity. Soon, he would. I sat there on the floor that night, staring at the dog's bowl, and I felt the weight of years crashing down on me. My body was trembling, not just from hunger, but from the shame that burned inside me. My eyes dropped to the ground because I could not bear to look at my son. I could not bear to see the smirk on his face or the laughter in his wife's eyes. So I lowered my gaze and kept silent. That silence was heavier than chains. It pressed down on me, crushing me in a way no physical labor ever had. I remembered the past as I sat there. The countless nights when I skipped meals so my son could eat. The winters when I froze so he could stay warm. The years I worked until my bones ached, so he could sleep in comfort. All of it rushed through my mind in those moments. And now here I was, an old man with nothing but humiliation in return. My son, the boy I had protected with my very life, had turned my sacrifices into ashes. He did not see love in my actions anymore. He saw weakness. He did not see devotion. He saw a burden. I pushed the bowl away. My stomach twisted with pain, but I could not bring myself to eat scraps from the ground. I would rather starve than lose the last piece of dignity left in me. My hands shook, my lips trembled, but I remained quiet. I gave him no words, no fight, no answer. Because sometimes silence is louder than shouting. My silence that night was not weakness. It was the beginning of something else. When I went to my room, I lay in the dark with my eyes wide open. I could hear their laughter echoing down the hall. I could hear their voices mocking me, dismissing me, reducing me to nothing. I felt my heart ache in a way I cannot describe. It was not just the pain of being humiliated. It was the pain of realizing that my son no longer saw me as his father. He saw me as less than an animal. That truth cut deeper than any knife. I thought of my wife, his mother, and how she would have wept if she had lived to see this day. She had once told me that our boy would make us proud. She believed he would carry our love with honor. I had believed it too. But lying there in the darkness, I knew we had been wrong. The boy we loved so deeply had grown into a man who no longer valued us, no longer remembered us, no longer cared for us. The humiliation sat in my chest like a stone. I replayed the moment again and again. His finger pointing to the floor, his smirk, her laughter, my knees bent on the cold ground, the dog's bowl staring at me as if it knew the truth, that I had been reduced to this by my own child. And every time I thought of it, my shame deepened, but so did my resolve. I told myself, this silence is not the end. This silence will become my strength, because silence can break a man if he lets it, but silence can also build fire if he holds it inside long enough. And that night, my silence was fire. Quiet, hidden, waiting. I understood something as I lay awake. My son believed the fortune I built was his. He believed the house he lived in was his. He believed the business I funded was his. He believed the $3 million I had earned with my sweat was already in his hands. That arrogance made him careless. That arrogance made him cruel. He thought I had no power left, but he forgot the truth. The truth was simple. Everything was still under my name. Every account, every deed, every investment, all of it was mine. And as I lay in the darkness, humiliated but awake, I realized I still held the keys to everything he thought belonged to him. That realization gave me strength. It gave me calm. I did not need to argue with him. I did not need to shout at him. I did not need to curse him. All I needed to do was wait for the right moment, and my silence would become the loudest answer he had ever heard. The next morning, when I saw him at the table, he smirked at me again, as if to remind me of my place. I did not answer. I lowered my eyes. I let him believe I was broken. I let him believe I was powerless. Because sometimes the best revenge is built in silence, where no one can see it growing. And in that silence, I made my decision. From that day forward, I carried my humiliation quietly, but I also carried my plan. Every time he mocked me, every time his wife dismissed me, every time they treated me as if I was nothing, I reminded myself, they do not know what is coming. They do not know what I still control. They do not know that their arrogance is built on my foundation, and when I take it away, everything will fall. I ate little. I spoke little. I moved quietly through the house, and I let them believe they had won. But inside, I was counting. I was remembering. I was preparing. Because a father may suffer in silence, but when his silence turns to action, it is a storm no one can stop. And that storm had already begun inside me. My son thought he had stripped me of everything. He thought by laughing at me, by pointing me to the floor, by treating me like a beggar, he had proven his power. But what he forgot is that real power does not sit in cruel words. Real power does not live in arrogance. Real power lives in silence, in patience, in the quiet strength of a man who has seen more than his child could ever imagine. My son forgot that while he was mocking me, I was still the one who built the very ground under his feet. He walked around the house as if it belonged to him. He spoke of the business as if he created it. He told his friends he was wealthy, that he was successful, that he was self-made. But the truth was different. Every brick of that house was mine. Every investment was mine. Every account, every deed, every paper with a signature, all of it still carried my name, not his, mine. The $3 million he boasted about was not his fortune. It was mine. And the cruelest mistake he made was forgetting that. I used to sit in the living room, quiet and small in his eyes, but I would look around at the walls, the furniture, the cars outside, and I would remind myself, I paid for this. I built this. He would have none of it if not for me. Without me, there would be no roof over his head, no car for him to drive, no business for him to claim. Without me, he would have been just another man struggling to make rent. He had forgotten, but I had not. I remembered signing every check for his school fees. I remembered working 2 jobs to send him to a university that I could barely afford. I remembered selling my own savings bonds so he could start a business with no risk. I remembered buying the house, making sure it was free of debt. And I remembered carefully saving, carefully investing, carefully protecting the money that grew into $3 million. All of it done under my name, all of it done with my effort, all of it done with my sacrifice. So when he mocked me, when he humiliated me, when he forced me to face the dog's bowl, he did not realize that the man he was laughing at was still holding the keys to his world. He thought because I was old, because my body was weak, because I kept silent, I was powerless. But the truth is, silence is not weakness. Silence is waiting. Silence is choosing the right moment. I began to see the picture clearly. My son believed he was untouchable. He believed his arrogance was justified because he thought everything was already his. He thought that one day I would die, and all of it would simply fall into his lap. He thought there was nothing I could do to stop him. And that blind belief made him reckless. He forgot the truth. He forgot the law. He forgot that as long as I lived, every account, every paper, every deed still belonged to me, and I could do with it whatever I wished. That realization gave me strength. It reminded me that even though I sat in silence, even though I endured humiliation, I was not powerless. In fact, I was the most powerful person in the house. He just did not see it. And maybe that was my greatest weapon. I started to look at my silence differently. It was no longer just the silence of shame. It was the silence of control. He thought he had broken me, but in truth, I was watching him dig his own downfall. With every laugh, with every insult, with every cruel act, he made me stronger. Because each one reminded me why I needed to act. Each one reminded me that my silence had to end not with words, but with something permanent. I would sit at the table sometimes and watch him boast about his wealth, and in my heart, I would almost smile. Because he was boasting about things that were not his. He was boasting about riches that could vanish with one signature, one meeting, one phone call from me. He had no idea that while he mocked me, I held the power to erase the very life he was so proud of. And that was the power he forgot. He thought age had made me weak. He thought humility had made me powerless. He thought silence meant defeat. But in truth, I was the storm waiting at the edge of his sky. He just had not seen it yet. I told myself again and again, I am not powerless. I am not a burden. I am not a man with nothing. I am the man who still holds everything. And when the time comes, my son will learn what it means to forget the hand that fed him, to forget the man who gave him everything, to forget the father who could still take it all away. And that time was coming. That night, after the bowl and the laughter, after the silence that burned through my bones, I lay awake in my bed and felt something shift inside me. I had lived my whole life bending for others, breaking myself so my son could stand tall. I had accepted hunger so he could eat, accepted pain so he could grow, accepted loneliness so he could feel surrounded. But as I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, I realized I could no longer live that way. I had carried the weight for too long, and now that weight was crushing me. Something had to change. I thought about the man I had become in his eyes, not a father, not a provider, not even a human being. In his eyes, I was nothing more than an old man taking up space. And when he pointed to that dog's bowl, when he smirked at me while his wife laughed, he showed me exactly what I was to him, less than an animal. That memory would not leave me. I could still hear their laughter, even when the house grew quiet. It echoed in my head, sharper than any blade, heavier than any chain. I turned the memory over and over in my mind, and I asked myself one question: do I deserve this? And the answer, for the first time, was clear. Number. I did not deserve this. I had lived a life of sacrifice, a life of work, a life of giving. I had given every piece of myself to build a fortune, to build a house, to build a future for a boy who now treated me with cruelty. I had been a father every second of my life, but he had not been a son. And if he could not give me love, then I had no reason left to keep giving him everything I had built. That was when the decision came to me. Quiet at first, like a whisper, but then louder, stronger, until it filled my whole chest. I decided I would not die humiliated. I would not die remembered as a man who ate from the floor like a dog. I would not leave this earth with my son's cruelty as my last memory. I would leave with dignity, and I would leave with justice. I thought about the fortune, the 3 million that he believed was already his. He walked around as though it belonged to him, but I knew the truth. It was mine. Still mine. Every account, every deed, every paper carried my name, not his. And as long as I lived, I had the power to take it away. That realization became my weapon. If he wanted me to eat like a dog, then I would make him live like one. If he wanted to strip me of dignity, then I would strip him of comfort. If he wanted to laugh at my hunger, then I would teach him what hunger really felt like. It was not an easy decision. A father's heart does not break away from love in a single moment. Even after all his cruelty, a part of me still remembered the boy he used to be. The boy who once held my hand, the boy who once called me father, the boy I once dreamed would honor me. That memory tried to hold me back. But then I remembered the bowl, the smirk, the laughter, the shame. I remembered my wife's face in my mind, how she would have cried if she had seen her son treat me this way. And I knew then, this was no longer about love, this was about dignity, this was about justice. So I made my decision. I would act. I would not shout. I would not argue. I would not strike him with my hands or curse him with my words. My revenge would be silent, permanent, and clean. I would take back what I had given. I would reclaim my fortune. I would erase his arrogance with the truth that he was nothing without me. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing but my heart strangely calm. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control again. I felt like I had power again. Not the power of youth, not the power of strength, but the power of knowledge, the power of patience, the power of a father who still held the keys. My silence was no longer weakness. It was the mask hiding the storm I was about to unleash. I whispered to myself in that darkness, enough. No more humiliation. No more silence. No more waiting. It ends now. And in that moment, the decision was sealed. I knew what I had to do. The morning after my decision, I woke up with a different kind of strength inside me. My body was still old, my back still ached, my hands still shook when I reached for my cup of tea. But my spirit was no longer broken. For the first time in many years, I felt alive with purpose. I moved slowly through the house, and my son smirked at me as usual, still believing I was weak and powerless. He did not know that his arrogance had already sealed his fate. He thought I was still the quiet old man who would take any insult in silence. But inside, I was no longer silent. I was planning. I spent that whole day thinking of every step I needed to take. I had built the fortune with care, and I knew exactly where every dollar lived. Every account, every property, every investment, all of it was still under my name. He had been foolish enough never to check, never to question, because he believed time itself would hand it over to him when I was gone. He had forgotten the truth. While I was alive, I still controlled it all. The very next morning, I walked to the lawyer's office. The same lawyer who had helped me through the years with my investments. The same lawyer who had watched me grow my savings from a few coins into millions. He looked surprised to see me, but when I told him what I wanted, he nodded with quiet understanding. I signed the papers carefully, my hands steady with purpose. I moved every dollar, every account, every asset into a private holding that only I could touch. $3 million, gone from his reach in a matter of hours. The fortune he thought was already his slipped quietly out of his hands while he sat at home laughing, unaware that the ground beneath him was being pulled away. When I left the lawyer's office, I did not stop. I went straight to the banks. I walked with slow steps, but each step felt powerful. The clerks looked at me with respect, because in their eyes I was not just an old man. I was the account holder, the owner, the man with authority. They did not see weakness. They saw the name on the accounts, and that name was mine. I gave them instructions. I signed documents. I closed accounts that had his name tied as a beneficiary. I shifted funds into accounts only I could access. One by one, I cut every rope that connected him to my fortune. I remember holding the pen in my hand, pressing it against the paper, and feeling a strange peace. For so long, I had been treated as powerless, but with every signature, I was reminded of the truth. I was still the one in control. With each page I signed, I could almost hear the sound of his pride cracking, though he did not yet know what was happening. By the end of the day, it was done. $3 million, his imagined inheritance, his claimed wealth, his pride and arrogance, was no longer within his reach. It was mine again, secured where only I could touch it. My son did not know it yet, but his world had already changed. The cards he flashed, the business he bragged about, the luxuries he thought were guaranteed, all of it now hung on air, and air does not last. When I returned home that evening, he was sitting in the living room with his wife, laughing about something meaningless. He looked at me and smirked, as if reminding me of my place. I said nothing. I walked past him with quiet steps, carrying my secret like armor. He thought I was the same broken man who had bent to his cruelty. He did not know that in silence I had erased his kingdom. He did not know that in one day I had undone his entire future. That night, as I lay in my bed, I felt no shame. For the first time in a long time, I felt dignity. I thought of the dog's bowl, of the laughter, of the humiliation, and I whispered to myself, now the balance is restored. He had wanted me to feel powerless, but I had shown myself, even if not yet to him, that power was still mine. The execution of my plan was not loud, it was not violent, it was not filled with shouting or confrontation. It was quiet, patient, and precise, the same way I had lived my life, and that was the beauty of it. He had no idea yet. He would not realize until his cards were declined, until his bills piled up, until the life he had built on my sacrifice began to collapse. And when that moment came, he would remember. He would remember the father he laughed at, the father he humiliated, the father he forced to eat like a dog. And he would finally understand what real power looked like. That night, I closed my eyes with peace. For so long, I had carried only pain and humiliation. But now, I carried something else. Justice. The first cracks began to show only a few days later. I sat in my chair quietly, as I always did, and I watched my son move around the house with his usual arrogance. But this time, something was different. His phone rang more often, and each time his face grew tighter. At first, he hid it well, brushing it off with fake smiles, but I could see it. The storm had started, and he didn't even know where it was coming from. On the third day, I heard his voice rise from the other room. He was shouting at the bank on the phone. His wife sat beside him, her eyes wide, her lips pressed together. I didn't need to hear every word. I knew what was happening. The cards he carried in his wallet, the ones he used to buy everything he wanted, were no longer working. The accounts he thought were endless wells of money were dry. He thought it was a mistake, a system error, but it wasn't. It was me. I watched him pace the floor, his arrogance cracking with each step. He called one bank, then another, then another. Each time, his voice grew more desperate. I sat silently in my corner, my eyes low, my mouth shut. But inside, I felt the power shift. The son who had forced me to bow to a dog's bowl was now bowing to panic. His voice, once filled with pride, was now filled with fear. A week later, the bills began to pile up. The car payments, the utilities, the endless luxuries he had taken for granted. They all demanded money he no longer had. He tried to use his business accounts, but those too were drained. He went to his wife for comfort, but she grew angry instead. I could hear them argue late into the night. Her voice was sharp, filled with blame. His voice was shaky, filled with excuses. The house that once echoed with their laughter now echoed with tension and fear. The credit cards he flashed in front of his friends no longer worked. The dinners he loved to host came to a stop. Invitations grew fewer. His friends, who once clung to him because of his wealth, began to disappear. Without money, without the image of success, he was just another man. And they left him behind. I watched as he realized that his pride had been built on nothing more than paper, and now that paper had been burned. The business started to collapse next. Without my support, without my hidden hand holding it steady, it could not survive. The suppliers stopped trusting him. The loans he thought were guaranteed vanished. The investments he bragged about began to crumble. I had built those foundations with patience and discipline, but he had built only arrogance on top of them, and arrogance cannot hold weight. It always falls. His wife's anger turned into bitterness. She blamed him for everything. She called him careless, useless, a failure. I listened from my room, the same way I once listened to their laughter. But this time, it was not me they mocked. It was him. The humiliation he had poured onto me was now being poured onto him, and I did not need to lift a finger. The life he thought was secure was slipping away faster than he could catch it. One evening, I saw him sitting at the table with his head in his hands, the same table where he once mocked me, where he once told me to be quiet, where he once pointed me to the floor. He sat there now with no laughter, no pride, no arrogance. His phone lay silent, his wife stood cold beside him, and his face was pale with fear. I looked at him, and for a moment, I felt the sting of sorrow. He was still my son. But then I remembered the bowl, the smirk, the laughter. I remembered the shame, and the sorrow turned into calm. Because this was justice. This was balance. This was the fallout of arrogance. He had forgotten the hand that fed him, and now he was starving. He had humiliated the man who gave him everything, and now he was the one humiliated. He had forced his father to eat like a dog, and now he sat with empty plates, unable to feed his own pride. I did not speak. I did not tell him what I had done. I let the silence teach him. Because sometimes words are wasted, but silence can destroy more than anger ever could. And as I sat there in my chair, quiet and steady, I knew the lesson had begun. My son had lost everything, and he did not even understand yet how. But one day, when he thought back, when he remembered the bowl, when he remembered my silence, maybe then he would know. Maybe then he would understand that the father he mocked was the father who had the final say, and that knowledge gave me peace. The day I decided to disappear was the day I finally felt free. For years I had lived in that house like a shadow, unseen and unwanted. I had given everything, but in return I was treated as nothing. I had endured humiliation, silence, and pain, but after I reclaimed my fortune, after I watched the cracks form in my son's arrogant life, I knew it was time. I had nothing left to prove, nothing left to wait for. My work as a father was done. What remained for me now was dignity. I packed my suitcase slowly, carefully, without rushing. I did not need much. A few clothes, some papers, the documents that secured my new accounts, and a photograph of my late wife. That photograph was the only thing that still felt like home to me. She had believed in me, she had trusted me, and even though she was gone, I wanted to carry her memory wherever I went. I folded the clothes neatly, placed the photograph on top, and closed the suitcase. It was not heavy. For once, I was not carrying the weight of another man's future. I was carrying only my own. I moved through the house quietly that morning. My son was asleep, his wife beside him. Their lives were already unraveling, their arguments louder each night, their faces tighter each morning. But they still did not know the full truth. They still believed they had time, that somehow money would return, that somehow the fortune would be restored. They did not know that the fortune was already far from their reach, tucked away where their hands could never touch it. I stood for a moment at the door of the house. I looked back at the walls I had paid for, the roof I had built, the rooms I had filled with furniture and warmth long ago. None of it felt like mine anymore. My blood had filled this house, but my heart had died inside it. I turned my back and stepped out into the morning air. At the airport, I felt lighter with every step. I bought a one-way ticket, no return. I chose a place far away, where no one knew my name, where no one looked at me as a burden. I sat in the waiting area with my suitcase at my side, and for the first time in many years, I felt calm. Around me, people rushed, children laughed, announcements filled the air, but inside me, there was only peace. When the plane lifted into the sky, I looked out of the window and watched the ground disappear beneath me. Somewhere down there was the son I had sacrificed everything for, the son who forced me to bow to the floor, the son who thought I was powerless. But now I was above it all, rising higher and higher, leaving behind the chains of humiliation. I arrived in a new country with nothing but my suitcase and my dignity. The money was mine, safely secured in accounts that only I could access. I found a small home, not large or grand, but peaceful. I bought a table of my own where I could sit and eat meals like a man, not like an animal. Each bite of food tasted different now. It was not just nourishment, it was victory. It was proof that I had survived, that I had restored my place as a human being. I lived quietly, away from the noise, away from the cruelty. No one here knew my story. To them, I was just another old man who had come to live out his final years. But to me, I was more than that. I was a man who had endured humiliation and turned it into justice. I was a man who had been forced to the floor and had risen higher than the ones who pushed him there. Sometimes at night, I would sit alone and think of my son. I wondered if he had learned his lesson. I wondered if the emptiness of his life now reminded him of the emptiness he once gave me. I wondered if he remembered the dog's bowl, the laughter, the silence. And sometimes I hoped he did, because that memory, for him, would be heavier than any punishment I could give. I never wrote to him. I never called. I left no address, no forwarding number, no sign of where I had gone. To him, I vanished. To him, I became nothing but a ghost, a reminder of what he had lost. And in that disappearance was my greatest revenge. Because the money was gone, the comfort was gone, and so was I. I had given him everything, and then I had taken it all back. That was my justice. That was my peace. In the quiet of my new life, I found something I had not felt in many years: dignity. For so long, I had been treated as less than human, laughed at, pushed aside, humiliated until my spirit almost broke. But here, in this place, far away from my son's cruelty, I sat at my own table, ate from my own plate, and reminded myself that I was still a man. Each meal I placed before myself was not just food, it was proof. Proof that I had survived, proof that I had not been defeated, proof that no matter how deep the humiliation had been, I had risen above it. I thought often about the path that brought me here. I remembered the long years of sacrifice, the endless days of work, the hunger, the pain, the giving of everything I had so that my son could live in comfort. I remembered the moment when all of that love was thrown back in my face, when he pointed me to the dog's bowl and laughed as I lowered my eyes. That memory would never leave me. It was carved into me like stone. But now, when I thought of it, I no longer felt only pain. I felt strength, because that humiliation had given birth to my justice. My justice was not loud, it was not wild, it was not filled with shouting or anger. My justice was silent, careful, patient, the way I had always lived. I did not strike him with my hands, I did not curse him with my tongue. I struck him with the truth that everything he had, everything he bragged about, everything he used to humiliate me, had never truly been his. It had always been mine. And when I chose to take it back, there was nothing he could do to stop me. I imagined him sometimes, sitting at that same table where he once mocked me, his head in his hands, his wife shouting at him, the bills piling up, the cards no longer working. I imagined the fear in his eyes when he realized the life he thought was unshakable had crumbled overnight. I imagined the silence in that house when his friends no longer called, when the laughter was gone, when pride was replaced with shame. That image gave me no joy, but it gave me peace. Because justice is not always about joy. Sometimes justice is only about balance. He forced me to live in shame. I forced him to live in regret. I did not vanish to punish him alone. I vanished to free myself. I had carried him for too long, carried the weight of his life on my shoulders until I could no longer stand. My justice was also for me, to remind myself that I was not powerless, that I was not a burden, that I was still the man who had built everything with his own hands. Disappearing was not escape. It was victory. It was me choosing myself for the first time in my life. I lived my final years simply. I did not need riches or luxury. I had enough to eat, enough to live, enough to sit in peace. And that was more than I had ever been given in my son's house. I found joy in small things. The taste of warm food, the sight of the sun rising, the sound of quiet evenings without insults. Each moment reminded me that life can still hold dignity, even after years of humiliation. And yet, in the silence of my nights, I always returned to one thought. My son had made me kneel before a dog's bowl. He had stripped me of honor. But in the end, I had stripped him of everything he thought was his. He believed my silence meant weakness. He believed my age meant powerlessness. But he was wrong. My silence was my weapon. My age was my shield. And when the time came, I used them both. I gave him nothing of myself in the end. No letter, no call, no explanation. He was left only with questions, only with the empty hands of a man who had lost everything. That was my final act of justice. Because sometimes the greatest punishment is not knowing when or how the ground was pulled from beneath your feet. Sometimes the greatest punishment is silence that never answers. As I look back on my life now, I understand something clearly. He made me eat from a dog's bowl, and I made him live like a beggar. He humiliated me in front of his wife, and I humiliated him in front of the world. He laughed at my hunger, and I left him starving for answers. That is the balance I gave. That is the justice I carried out. And when my time comes to leave this world, I will not leave as a broken man. I will not leave as a humiliated man. I will leave as a father who was betrayed, but who found the strength to rise, to act, to take back what was his. I will leave with my dignity restored, with my justice complete, and with peace in my heart. Because in the end, justice was mine.